I want to talk about how to go from this to this. Let's talk about compost. Hey, I'm out here in the compost piles to talk about soil. Particularly, I'm here to talk about how to build soil, and specifically how we built soil on Millsap Farm. So when we got started about 12 years ago, we were a pretty typical Ozarks farm, which is to say a lot of clay, more rock than you'd like to have in a garden. And then and both of those kind of make for difficult growing conditions, right? So clay gets wet easily, and then it's sticky and slippery, and when it dries out it gets hard as a brick, and the space in between is just like a day or two. So if you're trying to do tillage or anything like that, it's really difficult to find a good time to do that. And then also of course the carrots and potatoes and really almost any crop, even tomatoes and things that don't grow in the ground, they all have a hard time in that kind of soil. So what we knew right away was we needed to do something to improve our soil. And I had read Elliot Coleman, New Organic Grower, which if you haven't read that, it's indispensable, fantastic resource. Elliot talks a lot about building soil. It's the framework of his whole farm, really. And I've had a chance to visit his farm since and seen that he walks the talk. He's got this beautiful soil that he's built up over the decades. And then anybody else you read really who talks much about market gardening like us, they're pretty clear that soil is the key to the whole deal. And so we knew that going in, but of course the other thing is, going in, you've got all these other priorities you got to balance too, right? You're trying to figure out how are we going to get the sod turned under, how are we going to get the seeds in the ground, how are we going to irrigate, all these things that take time. So and fortunately, when you turn under fresh sod, you do get the new ground effects. And so for the first couple of years, we really coasted on that. We had beautiful soil just because we had turned under a really long-term sod crop. Before we tilled it under, our sod had been in place for over a decade. And so that's a lot of organic matter, and we got a lot of benefit from that. A lot of bacteria and worms and so on that moved into that or were already in that matrix. And it took us a while to sort of exhaust that with tillage, but it didn't take us too long. Within a year or so, we were starting to see a degradation, and within 2 or 3 years, we were seeing a major difference from where we had started, in the bad direction. We were seeing that we had a lot less tilth than we had started with because we had burned up that organic matter that was present in our initial sod. So right away, as soon as we recognized that, we decided we need to start adding compost. And we had several different sources of compost we could use, but the dominant one here in Springfield is the city yard waste, which is fantastic compost, beautiful black soil. And you can see a beautiful shot of this here. And it's yard waste compost. It's fairly low nutrient levels, but it's got great organic matter levels. And it's made out of wood chips and bark and lots of grass clippings. And they do a nice job of composting that. And they turn this out for a really reasonable price. As of this video, I think it's $24 a cubic yard, and you can pick up as much as you want. Unfortunately, this spring, because of COVID, they're closed, but I think it'll reopen, and it's a fantastic compost resource. But the other thing is you got to haul it, right? So on the scale we're talking, which I would like to put on hundreds of yards of compost a year, that was a lot of effort to haul that out here. So that was something we did early on quite a bit. My brother has a little dump truck, and we would haul it out here in a very small, 3 to 4 cubic yards at a time, which is pretty heavy, but we could get it out here and get it dumped on the fields or moved out on the fields. And because it was expensive, and not really expensive, I guess, but difficult to haul, kind of expensive to haul, and just because of the labor and effort involved in that, we were only really able to practically apply less than an inch in a bed as we went along. Still a major improvement. That compost made big difference in the health of our crops, and we still use that method with the city compost on a lot of our direct seeded beds as a top dressing. We kind of consider it the icing on the cake. But really what you need to get into eventually, if you're serious about long-term crop growing and health, is the cake itself, right? So what are you going to get down in that deep in that soil? How are you going to build up tilth? And when I talk about tilth, by the way, I think most people probably know what that is, but that's basically how does your soil feel, right? Is it friable? Is it loose? Is it got passages through it that allow water and air to move? The opposite of good tilth would be something like a flattened pancake, maybe a road bed or something. And really good tilth would be like that picture of compost that I showed in the opening scene, where it's really our soil that has been built up over the years to have this texture that you can dig a shovel into easily. It's got lots of space for worms and pores and things like that. So what we're doing on our farm is we are collecting pretty much all the organic matter that we can get. And so what that looks like is we've got a dump trailer. We haul bedding from the fairgrounds, which is fairly nearby. And we also have a lot of chipper truck crews that drop loads of wood chips. Right now we're getting about 2 loads of wood chips a day. Tremendous amount of wood chips. And we get a lot of compost material from local restaurants. Neighborhood Mill sends us their coffee grounds, and we get some kitchen scraps from them as well. Those go to the pigs. And then we toss a lot of spent grains from a local brewing company, White River Brewing Company. We get their spent grain, and we use a lot of that in our compost as well. So what we're doing essentially is taking kind of high carbon organic matter, so things like wood chips, straw, and hay, and we're adding a lot of nitrogen compost materials like the coffee grounds, the food scraps, the spent grains, and then some of the things that are kind of have the right ratio to begin with. So for example, a lot of the leaves we receive have fairly high sugar content, and so they're pretty high, they're pretty fast decomposing without any addition of nitrogen. And anyway, all that stuff gets put together into these giant windrows. And so these windrows are about 100 feet long, about 12 feet tall, wide, and about 7 or 8 feet tall. Of course, they settle some as they decompose. In fact, overall, we consider that we're going to get about 1 cubic yard of compost out of 1.5 to 3 cubic yards of material, depending on the fluff. So there's, leaves are super fluffy, wood chips a lot less so. But they're all going to decompose around 50%. And we're going to lose a lot of bulk, but what we're gaining is this beautiful black kind of chocolate cake-like texture that we get in our compost. We do this, we manage these piles with a combination of tools. We have our little John Ford 1710 tractor, which is a little 4-wheel drive, 3-cylinder diesel, 27 horsepower, got a front end loader on it, and it will do the job, but it's a lot of time and effort. And so what we do instead, we borrow a skid steer about 3 or 4 days every quarter. So, about 15 days a year. And that is just about enough time for us to turn all of our piles, move things around, scrape material out of the pig pen, and put new bedding into the pig pen, and kind of get all that done in a fairly intensive 3 or 4 days of effort. And that's how we've been managing our compost piles for the last couple of years. So all this together means that we're taking this raw material, wood chips, fairgrounds bedding, spent grains, coffee grounds, food waste, leaves from neighborhoods, grass clippings. We're taking all that and we're kind of combining it pretty loosely. It's not a thorough mixing process, but we're combining it into these windrows. Light on the wood chips, heavy on the leaves if we can. And then we are stacking that up in these about 3 big windrows to start. Those windrows will sit there for several months, usually 3 to 6 months, depending on how quickly stuff is coming in. And then it'll go into the pig pen. We call that our pigerator. That's a term we stole from Joel Salatin. I love that phrase. And the pigs love compost. I mean, this is their job, and they do it with a gusto and abandon. They love digging holes. They love scrounging around in it, trying to find anything that might be interesting and edible. And they just like digging. You can see when you come out to our farm, you'll see pigs digging craters in the compost. And part of that is there's interesting things down in there, and part of it is because It's just what they like it doing. And there's a warm spot down in those compost piles, of course, too. And so in the wintertime, in the spring and fall, you'll find them digging kind of nests down in there to warm up. Well, in that process, they're homogenizing. So they're actually really thoroughly mixing. And of course, they're adding their own manure. And then we're also adding weeds and seconds vegetables, rotten squash and tomatoes, things like that. We're giving that to them and they eat it, or just stir it into the pile depending on what they want to do with it. Slop from our kitchen, all that sort of material goes into the pig pen and they turn it into this pretty homogenized, rough compost. Now, of course, that's got raw manure in it, and it's got a bit of a strong smell and so on. And so what we want to do with that is, now next step is we scrape that out of the pig pen and we windrow it for another 6 months, and we'll turn it once or twice during that time period. Now, what I should have mentioned from the beginning is, as soon as we start those first set of windrows, before it ever goes in the pigs, as soon as we stack the material up, it starts steaming. And that's really important, because what's happening when it's steaming is it means we've got a lot of heat in there. That means those bacteria are hard at work. And it also means we're killing pathogens and weed seeds. So what we want to see in our piles before and after the pig pen is we want to see them get up to 130 degrees minimum. And we want to see them stay there for preferably several weeks. 10 days is our minimum at 130 degrees. And we don't follow this real strictly. We don't check these temperatures real strictly, but we do have a long process. So the process from incoming material to compost going out in the fields is about 9 months to a year. Nothing really goes out quicker than 9 months. Most things it's a year or longer. And during that time, it's going to spend a great deal of time above 100 degrees, usually around 130. They'll even spike to 150. We'd like them to be more in that 130 to 140 degree range. And we want them to stay there, like I said, for several weeks. Every time we roll the pile, they're going to heat up that way, and it's going to stay that way 2 to 3 weeks. And that's important. Like I say, we're killing pathogens and weed seeds. And then we're moving this material out onto the beds. And as our supply of compost has grown, so has our ability to put generous amounts on our beds. So these days, when we are composting a bed, we're putting out somewhere between 10 and 6 inches on a bed. Now, we don't do that on every bed every year, because there are some crops that don't appreciate that kind of compost addition, like carrots, for example. When that compost is fresh, it's not good for the carrots. It's not really that good for the brassicas for it to be real fresh. But some of the other crops that we grow tolerate it pretty well, like beets, tomatoes, eggplant, and peppers. All those seem to appreciate fresh compost. And when I say fresh, it's cooled off. We're not putting hot compost out there, but it's still pretty chunky. It's got a lot of wood chips still in it. They are mostly decomposed, but they're still chunky. This is not a sifted fine compost. It's nothing like what the city is supplying in terms of a nice smooth sifted compost. It's a much rougher product. But that rough product does still have the value in terms of soil building that the fine stuff would have, and that is it's providing a matrix for those roots to move through. Worms and other arthropods, things like that, can move up into it really well. It holds water like a sponge, but also like a sponge, it won't stay saturated. Just enough water will drain out of it, so we still have air spaces. We still have good airflow through the soil, which is important for the healthy roots of plants. So it's kind of a really cool thing about compost. It both holds moisture and releases moisture at a good rate. So all that together means we've got these big, beautiful beds. Oftentimes, by the time we get that much compost loaded onto them, they're raised. And so we'll also put wood chips, raw wood chips in the paths between the beds, which will eventually become more soil. And that's more or less the process. We are also adding to that fresh compost, we're adding some base fertilizer, organic fertilizer that we make here on farm. We've put some azomite, a little bit of sulfur to lower the pH. Azomite is a trace mineral kind of matrix, and with a lot of silica in it. We also put a little bit of rock phosphate on there. We put some potassium sulfate to boost the potassium level a little bit, and then we'll add some nitrogen. And we use different forms of nitrogen, but alfalfa meal is our favorite in terms of growth rate and slow release, and it's a wonderful worm food. The worms absolutely love alfalfa. So we till all that in real lightly. We're only tilling the top couple inches of that compost bed that we've put out, and that's now ready for planting. And if we're not quite ready to plant into it, like if we're doing this in the fall, we'll go ahead and tarp that for at least part of the winter. We want to keep it moist, but we also want to keep the nutrients from leaching out of that, and we want to continue to allow that compost to break down. Our favorite way to do that is to prep beds in the fall and then plant them in the spring. But, you know, being a farm, things happen when they can, and so sometimes we end up composting beds in the spring, and that still works. We just have to be aware of what we're planting into them and think through our crop choices for those beds. So all that together, though, has given us this beautiful soil, this chocolate cake soil. And so I guess the bottom line is, if you want good soil, the surest way to get it is to build it. Relying on trying to find the perfect piece of land that has the perfect soil, to me seems, at least in my environment, overly optimistic. It's much more practical to think about how am I going to improve my soil to the degree that's going to grow the quality of crops that I want to grow. And that's what we're doing here. So thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed hearing about the compost on Millsap Farm and seeing some of these cool shots. If you enjoyed it, subscribe, like the video, tell other people about it. We'd love to build an audience and keep letting people know what we're doing out here at the farm. We love sharing. Thank you.